that if you look at Hilchos Avelis, the normal laws of mourning, things get progressively easier as time goes on. A person begins sitting Shiva, very, very severe. A person cannot leave their house. And then after Shiva, there's Shloshim, 30 days. In other words, the next 23 days. It's much more lenient. For most relatives, after that point, that's the end of the Avelis. For Aviv V'imai, there are some restrictions up to a year. But the whole trajectory of Avelis is to go from a very chamor state to progressively more lenient until you're eventually able to rejoin society. Then you have a yahrzeit, whatever. When it comes for the period of time that Chazal were koveya, every year, to mourn for the Beis HaMikdash, we find an opposite pattern. We find that we start, of course, the Emesis, a person has to be misabel over the Beis HaMikdash the whole year. That's very, very true. But the more intense period, we start with the 3 weeks, Shivas Arba Tammuz, and again, Medina de Gemara, there's basically no restrictions at all during the 3 weeks. All of it is later minhagim. And then we have Rosh Chodesh Av has some restrictions. And then we go to the week of Tisha B'Av, which is much stricter. Then we have Erev Tisha B'Av, the Suda Mavsekes, reaching its crescendo in Tisha B'Av itself. Meaning, public mourning and private mourning move in two opposite directions. Private mourning moves from the chamor to the kal, and public mourning over the Beis HaMikdash moves from the kal to the more chamor. And there is a psychological reason for that distinction. And that is, what is the tachlis, what is the functioning of a mourning ritual? When a person, Rachmana litzlan, has a private loss, their lives are devastated. A person loses a parent, a spouse, God forbid a child. They feel their life cannot go on. They're shattered. They don't know what to do. And it's HaKadosh Baruch Hu's ratzon that we continue to live. It's HaKadosh Baruch Hu's ratzon that we don't give in to despondency. So Avelis, Hilchos Avelis creates a framework whereby a person can eventually be habituated to rejoin society and live a normal life. Initially, person sits Shiva, people come to him. La'at la'at, like a person going into cold water. You put in your toe, get used to it. La'at la'at, the Avel becomes acclimated to normal life. He becomes habituated to regular society, regular activities. And at that point, the Kadosh Baruch Hu says, of course you don't forget your loss, but it becomes compartmentalized. It becomes in part of your mind, there is that loss. But you go on. It's the Ratzon Hashem that you build the world, that you contribute to the world. In Ruchnius, in Gashmius. So Avelis, and then even secular psychologists have remarked on the amazing healing aspect of Jewish mourning, that it allows a person to heal inside and be strong enough to go back to society. When it comes, B'Avonosenu Harabim, over the Churban Beis HaMikdash, we have, very unfortunately, kind of the opposite problem. How many people, and again, maybe I shouldn't judge anybody, I'll talk for myself, I can't get up this morning, I am so tzibrochen over the Churban Beis HaMikdash. How can my life go on? The first generation that saw the Churban, they felt exactly like that. The Gemara tells us in Bava Basra, in Parak Cheskas Sabatim, that there was a generation that said, how can we eat meat if there are no korbanos? How can we drink wine if there's no nisa chayayin? How can we possibly enjoy things if we can no longer give them to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? And the Chachamim told them, well, then you shouldn't have fruits because there's no bikurim. Can't have bread because there's no menachas. Can't have water. There's no nisa chamayim. So they realized life has to go on. But they were shattered enough that they literally didn't know how they could live. But as time goes by, as the years, the decades, the centuries, the millennia go by, At some point, we don't even know what it is that we're missing. How do you describe color to a person who was born blind? How do you describe music to a person who was born deaf? They had no shaykhs to color, no shaykhs to music. We have no shaykhs to the Beis HaMikdash. We don't know what it means to have nevuah. We don't know what it means to have the Shekhinah with us. In some ways, we have to say, in microcosm, in Zeir Anpin, as the expression goes, when we lose the Gedolei Torah that we've lost, and we feel a sense of loss, when we live, unfortunately, in an Eis Tzara, a time of Milchama, a time when innocent, good, righteous people die, get killed. Just yesterday, we had an event right in this neighborhood. So Hashem gives us the ability to be margish a little bit what it means to still be in Golus. But by and large, the Beis HaMikdash is a foreign experience to us. Geula is a foreign idea to us. We don't know what it is. A person might think, if you have a glatt kosher Chinese restaurant and you're in Yerushalayim, what else do you need? We have the kaisel, after all. The kaisel is a wonderful thing. The kaisel, the Shekhinah has never left the kaisel Maravi. But what is the kaisel? The kaisel is a remnant of a destroyed, it's not even the Beis HaMikdash, it's the remnant of the walls of the Harabayas that are otherwise destroyed. And what is on the Harabayas? In Eicha, it says, Al Har Tzion Sheshamim Shualim Hilchu Bai. On the mountain of Hashem there are foxes. I can prove to you from the Kenais, at least, that we're in a worse state than that. In one of the Kenais, it actually says, if you read carefully, I would much prefer to have foxes on your mountain than Edom v'Yishmael. It's in the Kenais. Perhaps we don't have foxes, we probably do, but Yishmael we certainly have on the Harabayas. So, if it's true, going back to my initial question, that the purpose of private Avelis is to get me out of my grief so I can rejoin society, public Avelis is working in the opposite direction, to allow me to feel some sadness, to build myself in. In other words, not to get out of my grief, but to get into my grief. That hopefully, by the chitzonius, and yes, it's chitzonius, not getting a haircut, not listening to music, not eating meat, depriving ourselves of pleasure, sitting on a low bench. All of that is chitzonius. But maybe, I'm talking to myself, of course, maybe, kulahai v'ulai, some of the chitzonius makes us realize what it is we don't have, what it is that we've lost. So it's eminently logical that the Mahalach of Avelis is in the direction of greater tzara as opposed to lesser, because the goal is not to get us out, the goal is to get us in. Because the Emesis were not even makir. What was the Beis HaMikdash? How do I know? How do we know what it was? How do we know what Gilei Shechina is? How do we know what Nevuah is? How do we know? But the Panovitcher Rav used to often speak about the Maisa in the Gemara, about a fellow, Yosef Meshisa. Yosef Meshisa was a Yid, not such a good Yid. When the Romans, before they destroyed the Beis HaMikdash, they wanted to plunder some of the great treasures in there. So they sent this Yosef Meshisa, who was enough of a renegade that he was working for the Romans. And they said, take out all the good stuff that's there, and you can keep a souvenir. So he schleps out a lot of stuff. He decides he wants to keep the menorah. Well, the menorah the Romans didn't want to give him. The menorah, pure gold, 1,000 talents, very, very expensive. So they told him, you can't have that. Go back and get something smaller. He said, I went into the Mikdash once. I will not go in there again. I will not desecrate the house of Hashem. And they told him, you go in and get stuff or we'll kill you. We're giving you an order. And he was willing to be tortured to death. He was willing to die before he would enter the Beis HaMikdash a second time. And the Panovich Rav said, what bothered him? He went in the first time, didn't bother him. He was willing to steal the menorah. All of a sudden, he becomes a Baal Tshuva. All of a sudden, he becomes from. All of a sudden, he's willing to die al Kiddush Hashem. The Panovich Rav says, yeah. What was the difference between the first time and the second time? Because between the first time and the second time, he was in the Beis HaMikdash. It changed him. His encounter with Kedusha transformed him. It took a person who was a Rasha and it made him a tzaddik who was willing to die al Kiddush Hashem. This was the transformative power of the Mikdash when it existed in Klal Yisrael. To be ma'orer a person to goodness, to tshuva, to kirva to Hashem, to be willing, even a person who had been a Rasha, to be willing to give his life al Kiddush Hashem. You know, in the Nevuos of Yecheskel, we actually have all sorts of Nevuos about the Bayis Shlishi. Right? The end of Yecheskel actually talks about the third Beis HaMikdash that will never be destroyed. Actually, as the Malbim explains, it could have been the second Beis HaMikdash. We were not Zocha, so you have to redefine the Nevuah to refer to the third Mikdash. And it's complicated because, as always, without pictures in Tanakh, it's hard to figure out how it looked exactly. But one of the hanhagos, one of the halachos that Yecheskel gives us when he describes the Bayis Shlishi is there are going to be different gates in the Azorah, in the courtyard. In fact, the Bayis Sheni had either 7 gates or 13 gates. That's a machlokas. And you know the Arizal teaches every shevet had its own gate, and if you didn't know your shevet, you went into the general gate, the Shara Kolel. In the Arizal said, it's Yadua, therefore, that is the makor of different nuschais of tefillah. Every shevet had its own nusach, and if you don't know your shevet, as most of us don't know, the Ari held that his nusach would have been the Shara Kaila. But be it as it may, one of the halachas that Yecheskel says, that did not apply in the Bayis Sheni, but it does apply to the Bayis Shlishi, is when you enter the Azorah through one gate, to bring a korban, whatever it is, you must leave by a different gate. You can't go out the same way you came in. This is a hilchas u'lemashicha, but this is a halacha liyasid lavai, that you enter through the north gate, you leave through the south gate, etc. And the Bali Musar say that there's a raya, there is a thought that this expresses. Going to the mikdash, you don't come out the same way you went in. That even the idea of a physical different gate indicates that a person is changed, a person is transformed. And that is even manifest in the physical idea, that you leave in a different gate. It's not the same way in and out. But you become nisabech. This is what the mikdash was. And we know that in many ways, the yearning that we have for Geula, the desire that we have, that Hashem should redeem us, is in itself the greatest segula to bring that Geula. It is the yearning that creates the closeness with Hashem. Rav Hutner used to say, a famous a short thought from Rav Hutner, when Rav Hutner made Aliyah, he said, the one thing he missed about living in Eretz Yisrael was the yearning to live in Eretz Yisrael. He says when he was in Chutz La'aretz, he had a certain kesher to Eretz Yisrael of always wanting to be here. And in many ways, the yearning of desire, as the English saying goes, absence makes the heart grow fonder. When you have something, even a Beis HaMikdash, you could take it for granted. The Mikdash could be taken for granted as well. I remember reading years ago, I think Feldheim published a fictional novel about Rabbi Akiva's wife, and Rachel was her name. So it was about, it was based on Gemaras, based on Makoros, but they wrote it in a novelistic way. So I remember at some point, the women were speaking, single women were speaking, and they said, why don't we go to the Beis HaMikdash today to watch the Korbanos? Because they could watch from a distance. And one of them said, nah, they do the same thing every day. Let's go to the mall instead. I didn't know what malls they had in those days. But there's something eerily accurate about that idea, in which even Kedusha could be taken for granted. So if there is a bracha in Golus, the bracha in Golus is it creates yearning. But the problem is, as we get less and less connected, we lose the yearning as well because we don't know what it is we're yearning for. But the Golus creates a yearning. And the Maral says, that is the meaning of the Gemara, that Mashiach is born on Tisha B'Av. It doesn't have to refer to the birthday of the particular person that is Mashiach. That could be any day. That could be another day too. But it means the idea, the kayach, the spiritual kayach of geula, of redemption, of binyan habayis. It is born by the depths of our yearning to be close to Hashem on the day of Tisha B'Av itself. The stronger our yearning, the greater the love, the greater the connection, the more we're zeicha to geula. And that is why we are told that after Mea V'Yesrim Shana, one of the questions that we are going to be asked is not, did we believe in Mashiach? Did we believe in Yeshua? Everyone believes. If you're a believing Jew, you believe. But Sipisa Yeshua. Sipisa. Did you yearn? Did you wait? Was it like an aching void in our hearts? Was it something that, in some ways, it prevented us from being totally normal because we were so fixated on this desire for a geula? It is the sepia geula that brings the geula. David HaMelech says in Shir HaMalos, Nafshi Lashem mishaymrim labayker, shaymrim labayker. We say every day now in the Nesorah, Tehillim, Kuf Lamed. What is a shaymer labayker? You're in the middle of the night, or the dark part of the night, before the dawn. And your job is to see the first light, and you're looking, and you're looking, and you're yearning, and you're trying to see that first little bit of light on the horizon that will signify the beginning of a day. And David HaMelech says, my soul desires Hashem more than the watchers of the daylight are yearning for the dawn. That is called Sipia Yeshua. And that brings the Geula. You know, it's interesting. We have a klal, the Chazal say over and over again, Shechinta begalusa. The Shekhinah is with Am Yisrael in Golus. So I once saw an explanation that why is the Shekhinah with us in our Golus? And let me hasten to add that even in Yerushalayim we're in Golus. And unfortunately we discover it more and more with the passage of all of these events that we are confronted with. Because Shteit Azay, if a person kills b'shegeg and goes to a near miklat, so if a Talmud of a yeshiva kills b'shegeg and goes to a near miklat, Talmud shegala migalin Rabbi imai. The Rebbe must go into Golus with the Talmud. Because the pasuk says you have to live in Golus. How can a Talmud live without the Rebbe? Memela Kadosh Baruch Hu is our Rebbe. We go into Golus. Talmud shegala migalin Rabbi imai. The Eibishter has to be with us. How could there be life without the Rebbe Shalom? But consider the following. The person stays in the year Miklat only until the Kohen Gadol dies. Let's say after the Kohen Gadol dies, the Talmud says, I like it in the year Miklat. I'd like to stay. Does the Rebbe have an achrayus? Once the Talmud could have left and didn't leave, but he wants to stay. The answer is no. The Rebbe's achrayus is when the Talmud has to be in Golus. Once the Talmud can leave, the Rebbe has no achrayus. Chas v'sholom is a very sobering machshava. And that is, if we are happy in the Golus, if we are complacent in the Golus, if we're not mitzapeh Yeshua, then chas v'sholom, even the bechina of shechinta begalusa can be lessened. Because we're no longer in the category of Talmud shegala migalin Rabbi imai. Because we're no longer in Gullus because we want to be in Gullus, because we have to be in Gullus. We're in Gullus because we want to be in Gullus. So one has to be mispaining. One has to be mispaining over Tzipisa Yeshua. What does it mean to yearn for the redemption, to hope for the redemption? There is a Talmud Yerushalmi, I've mentioned it in the yeshiva before, that kol dor shelo nivna habayis biyamav ki'ilu nechra biyamav. Tremendously powerful statement. Any generation in which the Beis HaMikdash has not been rebuilt is as guilty as the generation of the Churban. Now, this is not a self-evident statement. This is not obvious. Without the Yerushalmi, I might have said this. The Beis HaMikdash was necharav because Klal Yisrael, whether it's the first bias and the second bias, had tremendous aveiros. In the first bias, it was avodah zarah, gilui arayah, shrichas damim. In the second bias, it was sinas chinam. They lost it. We don't get it back not because we have those aveiros. We don't get it back because we don't have this special, extra, super duper zechusim to get it back. That's what I might have thought. The Talmud Yerushalmi says, don't think of it that way. You don't need a special zechus to get the Beis HaMikdash back. All you need, easier said than done, all you need is to eradicate the aveiros that were gorim the Churban. Therefore, if there's no Beis HaMikdash, any generation that doesn't have the Beis HaMikdash, so when Chazal say the Bayis Rishon was destroyed because of those Aveiros, I'll get to it, and the Bayis Sheni because of other Aveiros, it's not the Pshat, that's what they had. The Pshat is, that's what we have. And to put it more graphically, therefore, the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash was not a past event, but every single day, we are destroying it again and again and again. We burnt it down yesterday. We burnt it down today. And if chas v'shalom, we're not zeicha to the geula by tomorrow, and we have to hope that we can be, we will have burnt it down tomorrow. It is a continuing act. Every generation, every day that it's not rebuilt, it is being destroyed for those identical aveiros. And how do we destroy it? Because if you go back to the very first Mikdash, the Mishkan in the Midbar, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, V'yasu li Mikdash v'shachanti b'seicham. Build for me a sanctuary, build for me a sacred space. V'shachanti b'socham, so I will dwell in them. And Chazal say, it doesn't say the Shekhinah is in the building. The Shekhinah is in the heart and soul of a Yid who is makabel ol malchus shamayim and tries to live his life in accordance with the Torah Hashem. And we make our heart a mishkan for Hashem. Bilvavi mishkan evnech. Sefer Charedim's famous words become a beautiful niggun. Bilvavi mishkan evnech. In my heart I build a mishkan. And when the Shekhinah is in us, there is a Beis HaMikdash. When the Shekhinah is not in us, the Beis HaMikdash is only a building. Rav Dalla mentioned last night, again, the Medrash. Nebuchadnezzar was misgoya when he destroyed the Beis HaMikdash. He said, I have destroyed God's house. I am stronger than God. I have vanquished the Rebbeinu Shalom because I have destroyed his home. HaKadosh Baruch Hu answered to him, you didn't destroy my home. I don't live there anymore. In some ways, this actually means that Tisha B'Av, or the 10th of Av, because actually most of the bias burnt on the 10th of Av, but Tisha B'Av was just the final end stage of a process that had begun a long time before then. When there's no longer v'shachan, as if it's true, Mikdash symbolizes shachanti b'socham. When there is no v'shachanti b'socham, there is no Mikdash. When the Shekhinah is not in our heart and in our soul, The Beis HaMikdash is a building like any other building. The Taj Mahal, you have plenty of nice buildings in the world. You have nice buildings in Yerushalayim. Anybody can destroy it. Nebuchadnezzar, don't be proud of yourself. Kimcha tachina tachant. You have ground up ground flour. You've accomplished nothing at all. And that is why the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah describes so graphically and in such a heartbreaking manner the 10 journeys of the Shekhinah, step by step by step, away from the Beis HaMikdash. Every time waiting, yearning, looking back at whether or not we will bring the Shekhinah back. Leaves the Kodesh HaKadoshim and stays, over the Mizbeach. Then over to the wall of the Azara, then the wall of the Harabayas. Looking back, every time waiting. Till finally, it goes to the Harazesim, the last step. Looking once again to see. At any point, we could have been the Shechanti B'Socham, we could have had it. We can have it. This very moment. What does the Gemara say? Someone asked Eliyahu Hanavi, May Mossad Kosimar, when is Mashiach going to come? Eliyahu Hanavi said, Hayom. Mashiach will come today. So they asked him, Hayom, today? Well, you have to look at the rest of the pasuk. Hayom im b'kailo tishmo. You listen to Hashem. Hayom, it'll come today. That's the reality. Kol dor shelo nivne biyamav, ki'ilu nechra biyamav. What an achrayus. We can't say, those old generations, they really messed things up for us. No, they didn't mess things up for us. If things are messed up, it's because we're still messing it up. They were garim the Chorban then, and we're garim the Chorban now. So as a result, how do we build the Beis HaMikdash? Some people, based on another Yerushalmi, actually say there's a chiyuv to try to build the Beis HaMikdash biyadayim. There are some people, Temple Mount, Teres Karta, who want to actually do that. But without getting into the details of that and the difficulties of that, let me just say that both the Rambam and Rashi reject this as a matter of halacha. The Rambam says that the physical building of the Beis HaMikdash is the responsibility of Mashiach, as opposed to the Yerushalmi that says Binyan Habayis brings Mashiach. The Rambam paskins beferish in Hilchos Melachim that Bias HaMashiach will bring the Beis HaMikdash. And Rashi, as is well known in Masechet Shavuos, actually learns an even more radical idea that the Bayis Shlishi is not going to be built by us at all. It is going to be Yored Min HaShamayim. So if we have an achrayus to build the Mikdash, our achrayus is not to physically build a Mikdash that'll either be Yored Min HaShamayim, as Rashi says, or that'll be the job of Mashiach when he's Niskala, B'mheira v'yameinu. But our job is to build the Mikdash within our heart, within our soul. Our job is to make our mitzias, our neshamas, a place where the divine presence comes. And then, when we build a mikdash within ourselves, and enough of us do so, then indeed we will be zeicha to that Beis HaMikdash, Yared Min HaShamayim. Because V'shachanti b'seicham is a condition to V'yasuli Mikdash. See, according to this interpretation, it's not that from the Mikdash there's Hashras HaShechina, but the other way around. When the Shechina is within us, then we have V'yasuli Mikdash. So, if we look at the Averos that Chazal identified as being Gorem the Chorban, we have to ask ourselves, and again, I certainly never intend to give mussar to anyone. I'm talking to myself, and it's not. But just things to think about. Think about again. Let's start with the Mikdash Sheni. The Mikdash Sheni, of course, everyone knows. The Gemara in Yuma tells us the Mikdash Rishon was Necharav because of the three worst Averos: Avodah Zarah, Gilei Arayah, Shvichas Damim. And Chazal point out that notwithstanding those worst averos, the gimel chamurais, that a person has to give up their life. That golus only lasted 70 years. And the second mikdash, where many Yidden were Isaac b'Torah, was necharav because of sinas chinam, irrational, groundless hatred. And Chazal say, look how long that golus lasts, and we can add another 1,200 years to what Chazal were defining as the length of the golus at that time. It really would almost be fruitless or superfluous or obvious to be marich on the sinas chinam that exists. No matter which way you cut it, whether it's between religious, secular, different types of religious, different types of groupings, subgroupings. They say the Eskimos, because they live in a culture surrounded with snow, can identify 300 different shades of white that would be imperceptible to a normal, to a person who didn't live in that culture. Well, Baruch Hashem, or Harabim, depending how you look at it, we've been able to identify 300 different shades and nuances of frumkeit, of religious affiliation, determining who our children talk to, where we live. In many ways, that's good. In many ways, v'shteitzach, sehiris and mitzvahs, in yiras shamayim, very important. Of course, we have to choose the right environments. There's no question about that. We have to choose the right chinuch. Chas v'shalom. I don't mean to suggest anything to the contrary. But at the same time, we can make the choices we need to make in our avodah without disparagement of others, without being mezalzel in others, by understanding that even if, according to our shita, a certain hashkafa might be mistaken in some ways, that doesn't mean a person is Amalek, a person is a Rasha, a person is not deserving of at least being recognized as someone who is trying to serve Hashem. The Nitziv writes in his Hakdamah that the etzem machala of sinas chinam in the Bayis Sheni itself was based on religious characterizations, in which the person who seems to be frummer than me is a fanatic, and the person who is not as frum as me is an apikaris. It's only where I am, whoever the I is talking, which is punkt, the right nakuda. And the Nitziv said this is sinas chinam. When a person doesn't see the chashivas of another person. When a person is indifferent. Sinas chinam doesn't have to mean throwing stones. It could mean indifference, coldness. He's not my chevra. He's not my chabura. This is sinas chinam. A coldness, an indifference, not appreciating the efforts of other people, even if they don't fully fit the particular shita that I have, even if they're mistaken, as a matter of fact. The Emesis, Shlomo HaMelech says in the book of Mishlei, Kamayim hapanim el panim, Kain leiv ha'adam li'adam. As water reflects the face that you show it, so is the heart of one person to another person. What does that mean? The Gra says, when I smile at the water, I get a smiling face. Water reflects. When I frown at the water, I get an angry face. Whatever I show the water is what I get back. The pasuk says, Kain leiv ha'adam li'adam. A human being will reflect back what he is shown. You show a person that you're not machshiv them. You show a person that they're garnished. You show a person that they're rishayim. Then that's how they're going to look at you. Kamayim opanim, the Gra says. Again, it's not the time to comment on contemporary events, and I don't want to be marich on Tisha B'Av. But let me just say that a lot of the conflict, a lot of the bitterness, a lot of the acrimony, a lot of the hatred, if we would cultivate within ourselves, B'nai Torah, Ovdei Hashem, Charedim L'Dvar Hashem, Remember this, Charedim is not the name of a political party. A Chared, one who trembles because I want to keep the Devar Hashem. It's not about politics. If a person is a Chared L'Dvar Hashem, you try to see the good in people. Whether it's Hakaras Hatov to Chayalim, who are indeed risking their lives, Chiloni or not. Then the consolation prize, the pot at the end of the rainbow, so to speak, is Kamayim Alpanim Alpanim. They too will be Machshiv Torah, be Machshiv Avodah, be Machshiv Limud HaTorah, because they get a certain amount of Chashivas, Mitzidenu as well. And I don't want to be Marich on it that much. It's not really for me to be Marich. But when we think about Sinas Chinam, these are some of the machshavas that we think about. Certainly, there is a musig of hating things that are evil, hating things that are wrong, and being misnageh to things that are wrong. But there are ways of doing it in which one doesn't have to be mevazeh, mevayesh, tear a person down, in which things can be argued on the basis of a hashkafa, on the basis of machshava, and then kamayim apanim alpanim could be a wondrous way of diffusing many, many, many difficulties. They tell the Maisa of Rav Chaim Volozhiner that he once paskined against the butcher that all of the meat was treif, and the butcher, by some pretense, lured him out to an isolated area and was about to kill him. The butcher said, "You were mafsid my parnasa, I'm going to kill you." And there were Talmidim who were watching from a distance because they suspected there was something wrong, and they don't know what's going on. They're horrified. And all of a sudden, they see the butcher throws the knife on the ground, falls on his knees, and he starts crying, and he begs Rav Chaim for forgiveness, mechila. So they tell Rav Chaim, "Well, I see the Rebbe, he's a Hasidic Rebbe, he does nisim and niflais, maifsim. How did it happen?" Chaim Volozhiner said, now again, this is a dangerous experiment, do not do this at home. Rav Chaim Volozhiner said, "I knew when my life was in danger, I had to try to concentrate on this person's milas, to try to understand him. Yes, not that there's any mile in trying to kill somebody, but to try to understand his pressures, to try to understand his feelings, to try to feel rachmanis for him. And I knew, kamayim apanim el panim, he would feel rachmanis for me." Now, this is not a trick. In other words, if you just do it just to save your life, it's not going to work because you don't really feel that way. But if a person be Emesis and reaches that madrega, Rav Chaim Volozhiner said it was badak u'menusa. That person's going to love you if you're mishtadel to see his good points and love him. It's a ma'isa that's brought. From Chaim Volozhiner. This is the inyan of sinas chinam. Again, I don't want to be marking it too much. I'll mention one thought of the Sfas Emes. We say, in Vihi Sheyamdo Laviseinu V'lanu, Shelo Yachad Bilvad Amad Aleinu L'chaleseinu. It is not only one that has tried to destroy us, but in every generation. Aimdim Aleinu L'chaleseinu. The Sfas Emes retranslates the words a little bit. Instead of saying, it is not only one that tries to destroy us, he translates it this way. Shelo Yachad Bilvad. It is only the fact that we are not one that is Amad Aleinu L'chaleseinu. That has been our chorban. Because when there's Achdus in Klal Yisrael, there is a siyata d'shmaya. An emistic siyata d'shmaya. But now, let me move in a different direction. When we suffered the Chorban Bayis Sheni, are we misabel only over the Bayis Sheni, or are we still misabel over the Bayis Rishain itself? It's mukhrach from the Rambam that we are misabel not only over the loss of the second Mikdash, but we are still misabel over the loss of the first Mikdash, because even when we got the second Mikdash, we didn't get everything that we had in the first Mikdash. We didn't get Nevuah. And the raya from the Rambam is, because the Rambam writes, again, it's really, this is the mashmos of the Gemara itself. The Rambam writes in the Perush Mishnayos to Maseches Rosh Hashanah that they fasted on Tisha B'Av during the Bayis Sheni. They fasted on Tisha B'Av. What did they fast on Tisha before? They have a Beis HaMikdash. The answer is they fasted because the Churban Bayis Rishon was never given back. The Bayis Sheni didn't have Nevuah. It didn't have the prophetic power of the Urim V'Tumim. There's even a Lashon that didn't have Shechina in its fullest sense. And Memela, we were still Misabel. That's why the Pasuk says in Ezra, when they dedicated the Bayis Sheni, there were still some very old people, Zakanim, who remembered the last days of the Bayis Rishon. And everybody was singing and dancing. But the Zakanim were sobbing and crying, and the Pasuk says that this amazing, how many people could there have been? Probably not so many. But the sound of their wailing was louder than the sound of the joyous singing. So Memela, if it was true that even during the second Mikdash, we're misabel over the first Mikdash, then Kal V'Chomer, we don't even have the second. We're not just misabel over the second, we're misabel over the first. So that raises a kasha. Because if you go with the Yerushalmi that says, any generation that the Beis HaMikdash is not rebuilt is guilty of the same Averis that caused the Churban. So Bishlama to say we're guilty of Sinas Chinam, very unfortunately, that's not so difficult to conclude. But Avodah Zarah, Gilei Arayah, Shvichas Damim. In other words, we have to make a cheshbon hanefesh. Avodah Zarah, Gilei Arayah, Shvichas Damim. I mean, we're not that bad. Didn't murder, worship an idol, right? What is the cheshbon hanefesh that Klal Yisrael needs to go through? Avodah Zarah, Gilei Arayah, Shvichas Damim. So the truth of the matter is, it all depends how you understand it. First of all, Chazal themselves tell us that the Gimel Chamurais do not always have to be limited to the literal translation. Chazal say, for example, Kol HaKoes, when there is anger, Ki ilu oved avodah zorah. So, maybe I don't bow down to an idol. Do I get angry? Is there anger? Now, what's the shaykhus of anger and avodah zarah? It's not so pashut. The Baal HaTanya says that whenever we get angry, we are displaying a lack of emunah, that everything comes from Hashem. Because if everything comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, how can I be angry at somebody? Everything comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Elamai, I don't believe it came from Hashem. Ebazayis and Avodah Zarah, I'm not totally maimin in Hashem. That's what the Baal HaTanya says. Again, Tisha B'Av is not the time to talk. This is a bit of a controversial statement because you may know there's an Orach Chaim that actually says because of Bechira, people can do things to me that are not the Ratzon Hashem, but the Baal HaTanya is going with a different mahalach. Similarly, when it comes to Shvichas Damim, Hamalbin Pnei Chaverei Barabim, I humiliate somebody publicly. Ki'ilu Shofech Damim. Tamar was willing to go to her death in a fiery furnace before she would reveal the identity of Yehuda, unless Yehuda himself stepped forward and be made. Sadka mimeni. Because, again, the Gemara says, because this is called Shvichas Damim and has to be a Hareg Val Yavor. So, maybe I'm not guilty of sticking a knife into somebody, but Malbin Pnei Chaverei, Shvichas Damim. Maybe I'm not guilty of bowing down to an idol, but Kol HaKayes, Ki'ilu Oved Avodah Zarah. And with respect to Gilei Arayos, again, unfortunately, perhaps that's the simplest one to say we still have a problem. There are Hirhurei Aveira, there are exposures on internet and media, even if a person is not mamish, doesn't do some maaseh b'payil. We live in a world that is shakua business. One doesn't have to be marich. But I would add another nekuda too. You actually see from Tanakh itself and from Chazal's interpretations of Psukim that whenever there is a merchak, whenever there's a chasm, whenever there's a gap in the intimacy of ish v'ishtei, a shter in shalom bayis, that is called a bechina of Gilei Arayos, because there's a wedge between ish v'ishtei. So, we live in a time where unfortunately The coldness that exists are not only between some Yidden and other Yidden, but we have an epidemic of a lack of shalom bayis. So many problems in marriages and families. And we see that this is a bechina of Gilui Arayos, not because it's caused by Gilui Arayos, but pumfaker. Kishem that Gilui Arayos would create a period. So whenever there's a period, we connect it to a Gilui Arayos. My raya is like this. My raya to this is that in the book of Shmuel, it mentions that the Bnei Eli literally would sleep with the women that would bring korbanos. Now the Gemara says that's not shaykh. Anyone that says Bnei Eli were chayte, like that, is making a mistake. But what's the pshat? These were women that were bringing the bird offerings after childbirth. And because there's very little meat, actually there's nothing to eat in a bird offering at all, so the Bnei Eli put them at the end of the line. So they had to hang around the whole day till they got to their korbanos. And what's the problem? They delayed these women coming back to their husbands. What is it called? It's called as if they were sheichev then, because anytime you create a period, bein ish liyishtay, it's a bechina of Gilui Arayos. So that's one hezber. One hezber is, maybe we're not guilty of these things literally, but we can be guilty of them in terms of what Chazal equated to Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayos Shvichas Damim. There's a second hezber we have to keep in mind as well. Everyone knows the Beis Yosef or Yosef Kara, Maran, the source to this day, together with the Ramah of Halacha for Beis Yisrael. The Beis Yosef was also a great Makubal. And the Beis Yosef actually had a very good chavrusa. He had an angel, a malach, that he used to learn with. And the Beis Yosef even wrote a diary of Torah that he heard from this malach. It was called his Magid, his preacher. And there's a sefer you can get, Magid Meisharim, which is a diary of the Beis Yosef's interactions with his malach. In the sefer Magid Meisharim, there is the following story that is told. That the Beis Yosef was once working over a sugya, a very difficult sugya. And after a very long time, he had a pshat in the sugya. And he was very grateful to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that he had the light of the Torah. And he's walking in Tzfat, and you can imagine the narrow alleys of Tzfat if you've been there. And he overhears a shoemaker learning that same Gemara with his young son. Doesn't want to eavesdrop, but it's the same Gemara he was just learning. And the kid asks his father the same kasha that was troubling the Beis Yosef. Okay. The father answers the kasha immediately with the Beis Yosef's teretz. And not only that, but the father is critical of this 6-year-old. Why couldn't you figure this out? This is very simple. The father was annoyed that the 6-year-old didn't get what the Beis Yosef spent weeks trying to figure out. So the Beis Yosef was sabrachim, because if indeed this was so pashut that a 6-year-old, good, I mean, I'm sure they were, very, very, even the 6-year-olds were probably in a high madrega. In fact, it's interesting, the Gra gave his first drasha in Vilna when he was a 6-year-old. And he gave a long pilpul, and everyone was nispayel, but some people weren't impressed because they said, his father must have taught him. So apparently, if your father taught you a complicated triple at 6, that was not a big achievement. Okay, I mean, I would have been pretty impressed with that itself, but okay. But be it as it may, the Beis Yosef was sabrachim, because the Beis Yosef feels, why wasn't I zeicha to understand the pashtus of Torah? He asks the malach, what's my chait? What do I have to do tshuva for? And the malach told him, you have no chait at all, it's pumpakert. This Havana is very deep, very difficult. The world was not ready for it. But by your Yagia, by your Amelis, by your harboring over Torah, you brought it into the world. Once you brought it into the world, anybody could get it. Now, what does that even mean? The Beis Yosef didn't write it down. He didn't explain it to anybody. He didn't teach it to anybody. He's sitting in his room, and he comes, and he finally is able to understand something. So now it becomes easier for other people. How does that work? Rationally, it doesn't work at all, obviously. But metaphysically, our learning, our davening, our mitzvahs, our yegia b'Torah, not just ours, anyone's yegia b'Torah, brings Kedusha into the world. The world gets changed. Abilities to connect to Hashem become available that weren't available otherwise. And Mimela, even in Torah, that explains the phenomenon of the high school kid, being mechaven to the Ketzais or something like that. Yeah, the Ketzais brought it in, so Mimela, it's accessible to all of us on some level. So what does that mean? Anti-Semites like to say that Jews are responsible for all the world's evils. I hate to say that they might be right. Don't say it out of the room here, but they might be right. Because we create the Kedusha in the world. We create the Ruchnius in the world. The Torah, the mitzvahs, the person who is sitting in a room and learning and no one even knows about it is changing the world in one way or the other. The Chafetz Chaim used to say that the tznius of the fashions in Paris was connected to the starkheit of the learning in Radin. It's like ground zero when you have an atom bomb. So ground zero, the radiation is very powerful. So good. So the learning in Radin, so in Vilna, people will learn 10 hours instead of 9 hours. By the time it gets Paris, maybe you'll have a daily minyan with sneas, whatever it would be. But the point is, there's a hashpah. So, going back to the question, what am I doing tshuva? Avodah zarah, gilui arayos, shvichas damim? Even if none of us are guilty of those things, if we live in a world that is replete with certainly shvichas damim, certainly gilui arayos, and the Emesis Avodah Zarah as well, if you look at Avodah Zarah as putting anything ahead of Avodah Hashem, whether it's money, power, or political power. We live in a world that is shakua, not only in sinas chinam, but in Avodah Zarah, gilui arayos, shvichas damim. And even if none of us are guilty of any of those things, if we could have brought more Kedusha into the world could have been and would have been a different place. And therefore it becomes Kalape Shmaya, part of our achrayus. And that's why Chazal say, what is an apikairis? An apikairis, according to one view in the Gemara, is a person who says, Maya hani la Rabbanan. What do the Rabbanan do for the world? They don't do anything. They just sit and learn. Well, it's apikorsis. Yeah, because even if all somebody is doing is sitting and learning, the bracha they bring to the world is tremendous. We don't even know. But le'idach gisa, in our own internal cheshbon hanefesh, we have to know that if we live in a world of hashchasa, a world that's so mushchas in so many ways, we bear a certain achrayus that we did not create enough kedusha. So that's the second kesher to avodah zarah, gilui arayos, shvichas damim. Let me just mention a third one relatively quickly, and this is from Rav Tzadok. Rav Tzadok says that avodah zarah, gilui arayos, shvichas damim are really symptoms of certain root midos. And even if one doesn't have the symptom, they can still have the disease. You can have a disease without a symptom. The disease, Rav Tzadok says, are the three destructive midos that are enumerated in Pirkei Avos. Kina, jealousy; taiva, an excessive lust for the physical and sensual; and kavod, a desire for glory and ego gratification. Rav Tzadok says, kina is the shayrish of ritzicha, because when jealousy becomes very extreme, it can even lead to taking a life. And of course, the best proof of that is the very first ritzicha in the Torah of Cain killing Hevel was primarily through the aside of kina. Cain sees that Hevel's korban is accepted. Cain sees that Hashem seems to like Hevel more. Cain can't stand it. He destroys Hevel. He murders him. So kina can lead to shvichas damim. And to this day, most murders outside of the military situations that we face often arise through jealousy. Taiva will, of course, culminate in gilui arayos. Right? That is a sin of taiva. Now, avodah zarah and kavod is a bit trickier, but Rav Tzadok connects avodah zarah and kavod by basically saying the desire that we have to make idols is to enable us to create a religion that lets us be the boss. Instead of man being made in the image of God, Avodah Zarah makes small gods in the image of man. And Memela, ultimately, the aside of Avodah Zarah is the idea, I want to be the boss. I want to be in charge. I want to be the one that makes the rules. That comes from Gaiva and Kavod. So Rav Tzadok says, it may very well be, I don't do Avodah Zarah. I don't do Gilui Arayos. I don't do Shvichas Damim. But nevertheless, if there's Kina, that is the Sheirish of Shvichas Damim. If there's Taiva, that's the Yesod of Arayos. If there's Kavod and ego, that's the Yesod of Avodah Zarah. Or to put it a different way, I'm making myself an idol. When I make myself the center of what is good and what is valuable and what is right and what is wrong, I've made myself an Avodah Zarah. So Kavod is the ultimate Avodah Zarah that exists. That's exactly why the Gemara says, when a person is a Baal Gaiva, he pushes Hashem out of the world. He's dochek raglei hashchita, because a Baal Gaiva means, I'm the boss, I'm in charge, I'm the most important thing in the world. Hashem says, I can't live in the world under those conditions. That's not the deal. The deal is, he's the Borei, we're the Nivra. We can't do it the other way around. So Memela, the cheshbon therefore is, that based on the Yerushalmi, Kol dor shelo nivne b'yamav kilu nechra b'yamav, it is mechayev us to do a cheshbon hanefesh on the averos that caused the korban, because those averos are still here. The message I'm giving you is, it is not only the sinas chinam of the bayis sheni that is still here, and it is certainly still here, but it's even, in different ways, Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayos, Shvichas Damim that's still here. Because we are still misabel over the Chorban Bayis Rishayim, and not only the Chorban Bayis Sheni. Let me just stand again, I'm running out of time, with one final Gemara. The Gemara in Emesis gives another reason. Now, it doesn't say why the Mikdash was Nechrav. And again, you have to be medayek. Sometimes Chazal say, why is the Mikdash Nechrav? And sometimes they say, why was Yerushalayim Nechrav? And it's worthwhile to be aimed on this. But at least in the Gemara in Bava Metzia, it says that one of the reasons Yerushalayim was Nechrava, al shehimidu dineim himidu divreihem al din Torah. They followed the din. What's so bad about that? To follow the din? To follow din Torah? Halavai, we should follow the din Torah. How could that possibly be a siba for Chorban? And the Meforshim explain, it's not an avera to follow the din. It's a good thing to follow the din. But here is the point. Following the din in Dinei Mamonos, for example, would mean if I have a right to get money from you, I collect it. I'm not mochel, I'm not mavater. If your fence is a 32nd of an inch over my boundary line, I make you take it away. Do I have the right to do that? Absolutely. Are you mechuyev to obey if I want to be toveh? Absolutely. But here is the problem. The problem is, you can do whatever you want within the Shuras Hadin, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu judges us the same way we judge others. If we judge others with the Shuras Hadin, exactly al pi din, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu looks at us exactly al pi din. Al pi din, well, let me just say, we don't want to be judged that way. Al pi din, even the greatest tzaddikim might not be zeicha b'din. There's a famous word from the Shalach Kadesh. I wouldn't say it if the Shalach didn't say it. That when Rabbi Akiva was being tortured to death, and he was makabel al kiddush Hashem, the Malachai Asharei said to Hashem, Zu Torah v'zu schara, is that the reward for Torah? And HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, Shtaik, be quiet. Kach Allah b'machshava lefanai, this is my machshava. Zak the Shalach HaKadosh, Hashem's machshava was to create the world with midas hadin. Only later he saw the world, Bereishis bara Elokim, he saw the world could not survive. He was mishtatef midas hadin with midas harachamim. But for tzaddikim, he still judges them by the machshava. You hear the diak. Kach Allah b'machshava lefanai. Rabbi Akiva is being judged with my original machshava. But that's frightening. What's that saying is, with the pure midas hadin, we don't understand this at all, but I'm just telling you the shalah. With the pure midas hadin, even Rabbi Akiva can be judged harshly. Again, we don't understand, I'm just saying the shalah. So, when Chazal say Yerushalayim was nechrav because it's himidu divrayim al din Torah, it doesn't mean they committed a sin. You can certainly follow the din. But there's going to be a cost. You follow the din, you follow the exact rights, your entitlements, then the Eibishter will also follow the din. You have rachmanas, you have vitor, you have mechila, you have forgiveness, then the Eibishter forgives you as well. So it's another machshava. Obviously it's connected to sinas chinam, but it's really a separate nekuda. And that is, just as they say a word, some people say it b'shem the Baal Shem Tov, and some say Rav Chaim Volozhin, so it must be right because the Litvaks claim it, and Hasidim claim it. The famous word, Hashem Tzilcha, again from Kuf Lamed, Hashem is your shadow. Wherever you go, your shadow follows. I'm noyeg with Rachmanas. Hashem says, I'll be noyeg with Rachmanas. I'm noyeg with exactitude and hakpada. Hashem says, okay, I'm with you all the way. So these are things to think about on this day of Avelis. And as I said at the beginning, the tears that we shed on Tisha B'Av are the greatest way that we bring the Mashiach. And that's why Chazal say, or not Chazal, Pasuk in Zechariah says, that when the bias will be nivne b'mehera v'yameinu, Tisha B'Av will be a day of sasain v'simcha. Not just neutral, it'll be a day of sasain v'simcha, because our Avelis is what will bring the Geula. May we be zeicha to that b'mehera v'yameinu.